everybody. Welcome to the Center of Addiction and Faith and to our monthly webinar and discussion. We're really grateful you're here today. I love these webinars and I love doing this every month. We have a special topic and guest this month. Christina Dent is here. She's the founder of End It for Good, and she's here to talk about her work and her book called Curious. I just put a link in the chat page. She just published it. She is working hard to open everyone's eyes to some new ways to understand the addiction crisis and some new ways to respond. Her work is truly inspired and inspiring. Her book is called Curious, a foster mom's discovery of an unexpected solution to drugs and addiction. It's available through the link in the chat page. We also welcome our webinar host, previous guest, George Wood, Pastor George. We're grateful to have George join the Center of Addiction and Faith team for these monthly webinars. He's also new to our board, so he's just a huge gift to the center. We have about 150 plus registered for the webinar today, and we would love to know where you're from. If you would take just a moment and go to the chat page and just plug in your name and location, it's kind of fun to see who's here and where they're from. We're from all over the country. It's exciting. And toward the end of the hour, we'll have an opportunity for question Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom page. You can click on that. As we go, put your questions in there. We'll take them in order. Toward the end, we'll try to get to all of them. You can put your questions in the chat page, but we may not get to that, so it's better to put it in the Q&A. My name is Pastor Ed Treat. I'm the founder and director of the Center of Addiction and Faith. Here at the center, we are working to awaken faith communities to address addiction. I learned as a pastor of 25 years that the church is not doing enough and could be doing a lot more. When people look for help, often they'll turn to the church. And because of stigma and lots of other reasons, the church really has not played a role and needs to. The church could play a huge role in solving the addiction crisis. So by better addressing the problem, faith communities would not only save a lot of young lives, but reduce crime, reduce homelessness, reduce incarceration rates, so much more. Addiction is tied to nearly every social issue that we face today. Before we begin, let's pause for a moment of silence to consider those who suffer from addiction, and we'll follow that with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. As I said, today our webinar host is George Wood. He's a published author. His book is called The Uncovery. He's also just published a new devotional. He is a pastoral counselor and ordained ministry, a recovery ministry founder, and a recovery activist. A former addict and suicide survivor, George has dedicated his life to radically grace-laced, Christian-centered recovery for people struggling with addiction, mental health problems, and suicidal thoughts. George, thanks for being here today, and thanks for being our host. I'll turn things over to you now.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the show. So I have to say that, I have been blessed with, the honor of really getting to know people that are making a difference in this world, from, the different people we've met through the Center of Addiction and Faith to, just 2 years ago, getting to meet Johan Hari at the conference and spend some time with him, and, him being someone that was is really, a huge influence on me. And after that first, conference, I was thinking to myself, I'm going to go back because I really loved the people there, but there's no way they can have anybody that's going to be as moving as Johan was. And I was wrong, because I met Christina Dent, and let me tell you, I had not heard of her. And on the surface, of course, as someone who has been through addiction and his own form of hell and back, usually when you see someone who doesn't come from that background, we tend to be a little bit skeptical. We tend to be a little bit, maybe, dare I say, judgmental. And, so here's this, as she calls herself, a soccer mom standing before me, and she's going to tell me about addiction, and she's going to tell me about drug laws and all of those things that I've spent the last 20 years studying. And boy, was I blown away, just from the conversations that Christina and myself, had during the conference, and then getting to know her afterwards, being even a guest on her podcast, and then getting my hands on her book, Curious. And I have not been able to put the book down. It is not just a page turner, it is revelatory in the way that it approaches framing the drug laws, framing the crisis that we are in as a society, and the way that a soccer mom could even change her opinions. And so to be able to sit here today, it is an honor. It is a privilege. And Christina, I just want to say welcome.
Thank you so much, George. What a kind introduction. Brought tears to my eyes. I don't feel like I deserve that, but I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful also, and I'll just say up front, I'm always so aware of how I have not paid the price that so many other people have for the stigmas related to addiction, for the all of the harms that come. I have faced so little of that myself, and so I'll just start that way by saying I recognize that. I appreciate the experiences and the perspectives, and am always learning from people who have that direct lived experience. I told somebody recently who's in recovery, I said, I don't have lived experience. And she said, yes, you do. It's a different kind. It's
Yep.
just a different kind, and everybody's got a role to play. And so I'm trying to be faithful to what I think the Lord has put in front of me to do with the experiences that I have, which are not ones of recovery, but are ones of having this complete shift in how I think about these things. And I hope that kind of lived experience is helpful to other people who may be able to relate to that and be able to shift the way they're thinking as well.
Absolutely. It's interesting because part of what I try to do is really, show people that recovery is for everyone, because we're all in recovery from something. And most people don't really recognize that. And I think that often, the biggest thing that propels a person like me to heroin use or, alcohol abuse and all of the different things I've struggled with is always trauma. And the reality is we've all had trauma in our lives. And so knowing, the general broad strokes of your life, I was very shocked as I turned the page of your book and began I counted, I think it's like 4 to 5 pages, where in that section you go through the train wreck, which I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean an actual train wreck, literal. I believe you said one of the worst ones at the time that Amtrak had ever had. Just your experience of going through that train wreck, and then coming out of that, and then your mother going into her diagnosis and then passing away, and then relatively soon after that your father going into that. And that's a lot. Now the counselor in me is like, well, that's a lot of trauma. That's a person that's been through some things, especially when you tack on that you didn't grow up wealthy. You grew up, lower middle class and financially, not completely stable. So losing parents and going through these types of things while being very aware that you lived in a difficult area with crime all around you, that can be very traumatic to a child. So my question, let's start the show off with, how has that shaped you? And even though just now, a moment ago, you mentioned, you haven't been through these experiences, do you really feel like you fully recognize the trauma that, growing up in that environment, your mother, your father, and the train wreck all relatively quickly happening in your young life, how that shaped you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, for people who haven't read the book, I'm born and raised in Mississippi. I've lived in the Jackson area my whole life. Grew up in a wonderful Christian family, conservative family. Had a wonderful church community, close friends. I had the same best friend from the time I can remember. We're still friends today. And so my childhood had many of the resiliency factors that a lot of people don't get. I often tell people, even so, I think about these experiences, and yes, I've had a lot of painful experiences in my life, going through that train wreck, losing both of my parents by the time I was 23. And yet I look back on my childhood and say, I probably have one of the happiest childhoods, and I'm probably in like the top 5%, of people ever, everywhere, whatever. And I think that the more that I learned about addiction, about trauma, about risk factors and resiliency factors, it made more sense to me, because you could look at my life and say it's, there's this perfect storm that would sort of set me up for addiction. But there was also, for me, a stronger storm of resiliency, of support, of people around me. It was just a wonderful, close-knit community. I was thinking actually the other day about how often when people are suffering, they tend to sort of pull in. And why have I not been drawn to do that in my life? When I'm going through something hard, my knee jerk is to reach out. And I think that's because I was surrounded by a wonderfully supportive community where reaching out when I was hurting was met with support and kindness and compassion. That's unique. And to me, I look at that and say, how can we help more people have that kind of experience? I see that as the prevention work of addiction, where, we don't just say someone's life has been destroyed, how can we help them regain it? But rather, how can we prevent on the front end? How can we walk with people through really hard things, through whatever that season is for them? Because it's coming for all of us. The world is broken. Life is really hard. All of us are going to be going through painful things at one point or another. How can we walk together in that, especially in the church community, so that we have, that we're helping people do the work to work through that? At the time, after my dad passed away, I started going to therapy, and I've continued that, not all the time. It's kind of like I feel like I'm kind of struggling again. I'll go back, go for a few times. And I feel like okay, work through that season. And so I think that was, I was able to sort of channel that in a different direction through nothing in me. I see that really as very much the result of what I was surrounded with and the support system that I had.
Let's talk about, let's go right to one of the harder questions. Let's talk about the church community. You grow up conservative, and you talk a lot in the book about sort of you, I think you said your husband said something like you have the gift of judgment. Just, and I'm trying not to be polarizing, but typically when we think of conservative, we don't think of empathy. We think of righteousness and often judgment. So you grew up in a very conservative Christian background. How did that really affect you on this journey?
I think it, so I would say that I grew up, and I say this in the book too, really just kind of having this very simple understanding of substance use. It's like people who use drugs are bad people. People who get addicted are really bad people. I don't remember anybody saying those words to me. It just was sort of like the air I breathed of like, don't do drugs. You wouldn't want to be a person who does drugs. And that probably is not specific to conservative communities. That probably is just a lot of kids who grew up in the same time that I did. That was just kind of the messaging that we got was you try to stigmatize it so heavily that kids don't want to be involved in it because they don't want to be associated with being, a bad kid. So I think I picked that up, but that also got married with this very tough on crime. I was born in 83. So I'm growing up in the kind of tough on crime era. And also because of the convergence of evangelicalism and conservative politics, also at the time that I was growing up, there was this deep sense that, again, I don't remember anyone ever saying, but I just picked it up, that if you're a Christian, you support these tough on crime policies. Now, at that time, the tough on crime policies were a bipartisan endeavor. They were, people across the aisle were saying, we need to be tougher, we need to be harder, we need to lock more people up. But that for me was also combined with this sort of combining faith and politics in the culture that I grew up in. I remember I was homeschooled kindergarten through high school. I remember our homeschool curriculum. We've got crosses and American flags, on the same page and the same graphic. Like, I didn't even think about that as being odd until I came across a textbook from the same ones that we used to use growing up just a couple of years ago. And I was flipping through it, and it was really shocking to me. I just didn't even realize it then until I was older and began to sort of kind of think and pull apart the difference between politics and faith, the danger of really marrying those together. Because what happened for me is I began to think, whatever the political position of the party, my family supports or I support or whatever, that must be God's work. Like, that's God's will. And so that it gave an almost religious layer to the way that I viewed addiction and drugs and all of that. And I think that for me was something I never even questioned. I didn't have any reason really to question it until I was in my early 30s, and my husband and I became foster parents. And through that experience, met Joanne, the mother of our foster son. And she had been struggling with addiction for years by that point. She started using when she was in her early teens, and just wasn't able to beat that addiction until she was pregnant, until after her son was born. And so we got her son and fostered him. And as I met her, she began to change that narrative for me, because I could so clearly see that she is not this stereotype that I have grown up with. And that was life-changing for me. I as people read the book, you should read it and think Joanne is the hero of the story. That's how I see it. She is the one that has changed me. And put me on a learning journey that changed a lot of other things for me. And she's the one who's waking up every day for the last 8 years after 20 years of using, and has been sober and present for her son. And she's just a hero.
That was one of my bigger questions I had. How is Joanne and Beckham? How has that relationship really changed you? So you stole my thunder. So, with you not having a history of drug use, listen, I've started 2 nonprofits. It's a lot of work. It's usually not, very much, hey, good job. It's usually just a lot of work. So without that history of drug use, what drove you, this conservative soccer mom, get personally invested enough to start a nonprofit, write a book, do a TED Talk, do all of these things?
I think my parents modeled how to just use whatever influence you have for something that's good. They were not people that were out to change the world. They had a very small level of influence. They were very local. They didn't do public flashy things, but they were involved. My mom, when I was little, got convinced that trash was just really hurting the world. And so my dad was in seminary at a conservative evangelical seminary at the time. And she decided she was going to start a recycling program at the seminary. So she did. We've got like this newspaper clipping of her where the news came out and covered this, because she just thought, this is God's world. We've got to take care of God's world. How that should be part of a Christian, this kind of whole worldview of not just taking care of people, but how can we take care of the created world that God has put us in? And so I grew up seeing things like that, not huge things. She didn't start a whole organization. She just thought, here we are at the seminary. Can we just recycle and give that option to the seminary students? So I grew up kind of seeing that lived out. But for me, taking that to this particular issue that I didn't have otherwise connection to really came from two things. Joanne helping me see her as she really is. I mean, she just she wasn't trying to sort of not let me go, but I feel like God just put her in front of me and said, look at her. See her, really see her. Don't just see her behavior. Don't just see the things, the reasons why you're in this situation where you're fostering her son. Allow yourself to see her. And when she would, she went to treatment shortly after her son was born, and she would call me because he was with us at the time. And she would sing to him over speakerphone. And I could be sitting in my kitchen with him in that little bouncy seat, holding my phone while, he's this little 5-pound preemie. And here's this mom who's singing to her son over the phone. She has one call a day to try to connect with him in some way. She calls me every single day and tries to find some connection point to him. That is so incredibly vulnerable. Yeah. To let a stranger in on that kind of love. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I started with trying to sort of explain that away. Like, this can't be real. It's, just trying to get me to put a good word in with a social worker kind of thing. But the more that I got to know her and the more the Lord just kept her in front of me, I could not unsee that. And it was so clear that it was real. Mm-hmm. And for me, so there's this heart change happening for me over, oh my goodness, I have radically misunderstood what's going on. And there are so many people struggling with this. And the way we're responding to them is so dehumanizing, so stripping of their value and worth as a person made in the image of God. And then as I began to learn about addiction and really what was behind it, that just broke my heart even more. Of we are using shame and blame and punishment to solve a problem that is made worse by shame and trauma and suffering. It's a suffering problem, not a bad behavior problem. And yet we're making the suffering worse. And that for me just felt like this is really heartbreaking. And then seeing the scale of that is the other thing. I think that really is what catalyzed this desire to try to change it, because it feels to me like such a big lever. Like, it's not just a small lever that you're going to work really hard and it's going to affect 3 people. That is amazing work. There's nothing wrong with doing good work. God uses all different kinds of work. But I could see this big lever. This is worldwide. How we approach drugs affects all of us across the world. Some countries more than others, some communities more than others. It affects all of us. So if we're even a little bit wrong, we've got this massive impact, which means that if we make even a few positive changes, we can also see this massive impact. And that's the opportunity for me that I see that just drives me to see this change through and to invite more people to consider changing how we approach drugs and addiction so that we actually address the root causes of harm, because I think it will be able to just unleash the kind of thriving that we want and have not been able to get for the last 100 years.
Wow, that is super powerful. So for anybody that's tuning in, that maybe they saw the, the promo for this, webinar, or, maybe they know the book or whatever, could you just give like a breakdown of the work that your ministry does? So give the elevator speech to end it for good.
Yeah. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We've been in existence since 2019, and we do primarily education. So we are out in communities educating citizens, just regular people. Maybe they don't even know that there's something that they need to know about this. That's who we want to find. We want to find people like me who just don't even know there's stuff they're missing in the world. We educate citizens, also other advocates, people who are engaged in the space and want to connect to work that furthers the cause they want to see. And then policymakers, leaders, people who have the most direct influence in either the cultural changes that we want to see or the policy changes that we want to see. So we see those as both really important. They can happen separately, but both are really important, that the culture changes to address addiction consistent with what addiction actually is, and the policy changes that begin to move away from this criminal justice approach and towards health-centered approaches that really go to the root cause and address that instead of just reacting. Most of the way we approach drugs and addiction is reaction. It's reaction culturally to behavior we don't like. It's reaction with policy to people that we just want to say, they need a slap on the wrist and they'll stop engaging in this behavior that we don't like. It's been disastrous, and yet we just continue to do the same thing. So End It for Good works to bring that education. We think of it as the ultimate goal being policy and culture change, but the policies only change when enough people change their mind. So you think about your local elected official or your congressman or whoever it is. They are looking to their constituents, to the people they represent, to gauge what are the policies that they want. Most people in politics are not willing to risk their seat to go against what their constituency wants. And in some sense, we elect them to represent our views. And so if the views of the people they represent are criminalize, punish, let's keep going down this path, that's going to be where we continue to go. If they begin to hear, oh, wait a second, no, there's a shift happening. People want solutions. They don't just want reactions. They want solutions. And they want solutions that are in a different direction than we've been going previously. Then that's what we're going to begin to see. So we see that as, if you look at movements throughout history, you see small groups of people that began to work, it grew and grew, and it had the cultural impact that then cascaded into the policy impact. So people tend to feel like they have no power. What can I do? I'm just some random person. Everybody has circles of influence. Every single person. Movements happen because people take, in the book, I talk about a former police chief who's talked about your positional influence. Everybody has influence. Wherever you are, whoever you know, there are people that trust you. And when you're a trusted voice for someone and you share information, it lowers the barrier to people receiving that. They say, here's my friend George. George is telling me something. It might be new to me. It might be uncomfortable to me, but I trust George. And so I'm going to listen. Whereas if I heard it randomly on the radio, I'd probably be like, what do those people know? People trust people. Ideas move through networks of trust. Everyone has the ability to be an influence, to move ideas, to influence people. This is not for the Instagram influencers only. This is regular people. That's how this changes.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think right now more than ever, I think unfortunately politicians have learned that they can use Instagram and things like that to try to steer what people are perceiving as they want. And it's this whole narrative that I think as a society, and we won't go down this rabbit trail, but I think as a society, we're still navigating how social media and how short little clips of things saying things or whatever is influencing us as a society. So we need people like yourself that are actually educating people, not just firing them up with some, hot topic that they just throw out a buzzword. And so now it's like I keep hearing over and over. I live in Florida, and the governor just did a bunch of promo spots saying we're not going to be an anti-California, anti-New York law. We're going to be tough on crime. And I hear stuff like that saying, oh boy, here we go. That's actually coming back into the mix. Tough on crime in Florida. We won't be like these other states. And I'm like, you get enough people hearing that language and it can steer people to think the wrong things. And unfortunately, in a political season, we're sort of headed into a direction where your voice is more important than ever, because people need to actually be educated and not just fired up. And there's a difference.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting when you think about like what happens to us when we get afraid. We can't think, we can't reason. Like our brains just shut down. So anytime people are using just fear to message something, the goal is to get people to stop thinking and just react. And to me, that's one of our core values, is that we don't use that. We are committed. As much as I want to pound on the table and say, we have got to change. People are dying because of the way that we are approaching these issues, because of so many other things that I cover in the book that we haven't talked about yet. But as much as I want to do that, what is more important is that people have an opportunity to learn why that's happening. And they can only do that if their brains are online, not offline. So if I pound the table and yell and scream, people's defenses go up. They can't learn anymore. So I see it as our goal is to come in. We want people's brains fully online. We want them to be thinking. We want them to be asking hard questions, because we think that the solutions we're presenting are true solutions, but they do require that we think through why the problems continue to happen and what could actually solve those. They're not easy ideas. They're challenging. They challenge me. I still feel like I feel uncomfortable with ideas I put forward and curious. The world does not work on things that make us comfortable. Some of the things that are best in society are going to make us a little uncomfortable. And yet in a broken world, they can be still the best way to reduce harm. There's no perfect ways to eliminate harm. That's coming in heaven. But there are ways that we can reduce harm, even if they make us a little uncomfortable. And I think we've got to be willing to get a little uncomfortable, and also willing to really dialogue with each other instead of just lobbing grenades at each other and putting up our shields. Good things just don't happen that way. And we don't think, and we need to be thinking on this issue.
Well, let's jump into one of the scarier topics then. In your book, you talk about your son being treated with fentanyl. He was 4 years old. What have you learned about fentanyl, and how can we stop the overdose epidemic with fentanyl?
Yeah. So my youngest son, when he was 4, he cut his finger badly in a door, took part of his finger off and had to go. We took him to the emergency room. And I tell the story in Curious of the nurse coming in, and she's just got this smile on her face. Hey, I'm here to help. And I'm going to give him some fentanyl, and it's going to help with the pain while they get ready to do the stitches to fix his finger. Here at the same time, we've got people dying, grown men dying from fentanyl. And here a 4-year-old is getting fentanyl, and it's legal, it's regulated, it is the appropriate dose for a 4-year-old. And that it helped solidify experientially in my mind what I had been learning since I met Joanne. So I got interested in this broader issue by meeting Joanne and thinking about it from a consumer front, from people who use drugs. But quickly I realized, this is much bigger than just people who use drugs. There's actually a whole lot else that's happening, causing harm, related to how we have forced lots of drugs into the underground market by criminalizing them. And one of the things that happens when you criminalize something is that it gets higher potency and it's contaminated. So that potency incentive, because, if you want to smuggle something, you need a big punch in a small package. That's why people smuggle flasks of liquor into a sports stadium instead of trying to put, 6 beer cans somewhere on their person. Nobody's doing that because they're taking a risk to smuggle. And the underground market is doing the same thing. So when fentanyl became able to be synthesized outside of the legal controlled environments, it is everywhere now in the underground market because it's highly potent, easy to smuggle, and you can get a lot of people high in it with a very small amount of it. So fentanyl is all through the street drug supply, and there's no ability for people to dose it appropriately. So I'm not saying that we should allow everyone to go use fentanyl. I'm making the point that prohibition has brought us to the point where people are using fentanyl on the street instead of keeping fentanyl where it's been for 40 years, which is in medical settings. Fentanyl is still used every day in every hospital in America. It's used all the time because it's a very powerful and a very effective opioid. And we need that in medical settings. But as we have taken away people's ability to use the drugs they want to use recreationally, they have moved to underground markets that will sell them anything. And now that oftentimes includes fentanyl. So that's really hard because the way that we see it, for us to really address the fentanyl crisis, you have to address where people are accessing their drugs from. You can't just say, don't use them. Well, we've already said that. They're using them. They're using them on the street. That's why they're dying from fentanyl overdoses. So the way for people to change consumer habits so that they're not buying contaminated drugs on the street and dying from fentanyl overdoses is to allow adults to make a broader range of choices about their substance use legally. That makes me uncomfortable. I've never used illegal drugs. I don't drink. I've never used cannabis, even in legal states. I don't have any interest in that. It makes me uncomfortable. Drugs can be really detrimental in people's lives. But as I kind of take that step back and say, what could reduce the harm the most? How can we keep from losing? Right now, we're on track to lose 1 million people to overdose in the next 10 years. That's, I mean, shocking, unbelievably tragic. How are we going to keep that from happening? Because the vast majority of that is coming from people using contaminated drugs on the street. This is not people getting prescriptions from their doctors and dying. That's a very tiny percentage of the people who die from overdose. Vast majority is unregulated drugs on the street. How are we going to address that? You can't do it by just saying, stop using. That we've already tried that. It has not worked. But if we can open some pathways for people who are going to use to access uncontaminated substances, they are far less likely to die and perhaps far more likely to be able to get help if they need it. Once you label someone a criminal, it's very difficult to come forward and say, hey, I might need help for this. It's like we're pushing people out of society. We're stigmatizing them immediately. And that makes it harder for them to get help. More likely, they're going to continue to get substances from that underground market and be harmed because of it. So I'm willing to be uncomfortable. I'm willing to go through the painful process of figuring out what do regulatory structures look like for some of these other drugs, because I think it is the only path that we're going to find out of this overdose epidemic, not to mention all the crime that comes from the underground drug market also, which is devastating in communities here in the U.S., but also particularly south of our border in whole countries that are destabilized through the underground drug market.
Yeah, it's interesting. You make sort of this reference in your book about how, we don't see liquor store owners trying to kill other liquor store owners, right? But they would have back in Prohibition. But now it's so commonplace, we would never imagine two liquor store owners, plotting against somebody else on the other side of town because they're stealing their market, right? And so there is this revelatory knowledge of like, oh, wait a minute, if we didn't make it that, important for them to have to worry about knocking off the competition, that could change things, right? And so I just thought that was kind of interesting reading that line that liquor store owners aren't, plotting against other ones. So based on some of the stuff that you've learned, what are some of the things that we could do differently to get better outcomes?
Yeah. So your comment there, before I answer that, your comment there reminded me, there's so we think about like cartels in, south of our border, and we think like it's hard for us to envision people engaged in that activity doing anything else Like, it just feels like, I mean, if they were going to do that, surely that was going to be the path they took no matter what, whether or not, drugs were illegal. The son of one of the top kingpins in a cartel over the last couple of decades said to someone off the record, he said, without drug prohibition, my dad would have been a used car salesman. He was a businessman. He was a salesman. He was looking for opportunity. And the biggest opportunity he saw, was this massive pot of money from the underground drug market. And so it is very true that some people are going to have a tough time engaging in the legal economy. But there's a whole lot of people who are just looking at the options and saying, this is where the money's going to be made. And as long as we keep that huge pot of money there with prohibition, people are going to keep getting drawn into something they might not otherwise have been engaged with. So I think if we could move substances slowly back into legally regulated markets, it could help with that crime problem and also the contamination and high potency problem, which is causing the majority of overdose deaths and crime. And start handling people who use substances, whether they're addicted or not, just through a health-centered lens, thinking about the root causes of why people use and how we can help them be healthy and whole. And this is so much of what you do, George, of like calling out the best in people, helping them see and develop and own and live into themselves as a whole, healthy, healed person. Instead of trying to divert that into substance use or numb that through repetitive use. I think whether we do both of those things or just, there's a lot of people I'm sure listening who that legal market is too far. That's okay. Can we just work together on the other side? Can we just work to help people who are using not die and be able to access and build that thriving life? That would be transformational.
That is so powerful. What do you think? How can the listeners take action to move our culture and policies toward health-centered approaches?
All right, George, I'm going to have you hold that question real quick here. I'm going to do a quick commercial, and I'm going to invite folks to bring your questions. There's 60 plus people here. You got to have some questions for Christina and George on this topic. I'm sure they've stirred up some thoughts for you. So we'd like to have your questions. When I'm done with my little commercial here, we'll come back to those questions. But I have to tell you, I am so fascinated by this conversation, and I am so impressed by Christina, your ability to articulate these things. I feel like I could sit and listen to you all day. You're just an amazing person, and I'm so grateful you're doing this work. These are the kind of conversations that we're trying to bring forth. We're finding people like Christina who are doing this important work and bringing them forth. I've been doing work in this field for 30 years, trying to get the conversation going. And I'm amazed at how fast people lose interest in it and want to move on while it continues to grow worse and worse. This situation is also empowering some pretty bad people to do some pretty bad things. That's the other piece of this. The war on drugs has created a lot of drug cartels, and they're hugely powerful. And because of the way we're doing things now, it's really made a mess. And so we have to find our way out of this mess. And people like Christina are showing us some ways to do that. So I'm really grateful for that. So put in your questions, but please know that the Center of Addiction and Faith is a relatively new organization, and we are totally reliant upon our donors. People keep saying, "Oh, you need to monetize and charge for things," and I'm like, I don't think this is too important to make people pay for it. And so we're trying to continue to provide everything we do for free and make it accessible to everyone, because it's too important not to do that. But it requires your help. So if you can help, please do so. I'm going to put a link in here for our PayPal site. We also have a Venmo account, and you can also just mail a check to us. If you go to the Center of Addiction and Faith, www.addictionandfaith.com, you'll find our website, and there are donation buttons there and our mailing address. but we desperately need support. We have a limited lifespan without it, and we won't be able to bring these conversations up for you ongoing. So we'd like to continue to do that. Also know that whatever you give today between now and Easter will be matched up to $15,000. So we'd love to have one person give 15, or a whole lot of you give 10 or 15. Whatever you can do, please support the work of this ministry. I think it's vitally important. We really are about saving lives. That's all I got for that. We'll turn it back over to George and Christina and the questions that we've put up. It looks like a few have come in.
I can't see them. Can you see them, Ed?
Yeah, I can. I'm trying to figure out how to get me off the screen here.
You're too big.
I'm too big. There we go. All right, so there was a question earlier, and it sort of related to what you guys initially began talking about, and it was your lived experience. Someone said, do you get told that you're not an addict, so you really don't understand? Is that a criticism that you get, and what do you say to folks that say that?
Yes, I think there are people that would have that perspective, whether they say it out loud or not. And I think of it as using the experiences that we have to the best of our abilities. So I think, when we as an organization are thinking about who's going to go speak somewhere, we're thinking about who is the most authentic and relatable messenger for the audience that we're going to speak to. And so there's a lot of audiences that I'm not the best messenger for. If it is an audience of people who are in recovery, that's going to be a person in recovery, because that's someone who's going to resonate with that audience. It's not to say that I can't speak to them and it can't be helpful, but there's also lots of other audiences. So for us, we're thinking about, we don't just want to educate the recovery community, although we want to do that too, to the degree that it's helpful. But the broader society who just doesn't really know anything about this, or maybe their experience is only negative. Maybe they've got a family member who has struggled with addiction and they can't get past just being angry about it. And for some of those people, my story is more relatable, because it feels like here's someone who also doesn't have that direct experience, and they think there's something for me to learn because there was something for them to learn. And so I hope that in that way that it's helpful to people, even though I recognize there are a lot of people who have a stronger voice, a stronger connection point with particular audiences. And to me, that's just the beauty of everybody being able to use whatever redemption story God is working in their life to the best of their abilities, to the whatever way God wants to use it. And I hope that I can do that with mine in a way that is respectful of the people who have paid the greatest price and have been through so much, and also is helpful and useful for the experiences I've had that maybe can be helpful to a different audience.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Right. So where do you get the most pushback when you're out presenting?
I think it's shifted over time, and this just goes to show sort of how the cultural narratives around what's happening really impact us. We are all impacted by the things that we are hearing, whether or not they're true. We're just impacted by whatever the culture is sort of broadly shifting towards. So right now, I would say the biggest pushback is people equate shifting away from the criminal justice system as being a recipe for disaster, for widespread homelessness in the streets, for there being kind of anarchy. Nobody's held accountable. People can do whatever they want to do. Now, whether or not that's true, that's the idea that people are getting related to changes. And so I think that's number one, I would say that's not true. And I think research shows that it's not true. And also, I think it's a good opportunity to make this point, because this is what used to be the biggest pushback, which is you got to have more accountability. And that came across the spectrum. That came from people in recovery, perhaps most strongly from people in recovery, is that no, this has to be, we've got to have accountability. You've got to sort of cut people off. You've got to make them hit rock bottom. You've got to make life painful enough that they're going to see that things need to change. And so it used to be accountability was kind of the big thing. Now it's still, I guess, in some ways accountability. It's just shifted to this fear of what happens if you don't have that arrest. Well, does it just mean everybody can do whatever they want to? And I would say, think about how we handle alcohol. Alcohol is just such a good example for so many parts of this. It's a good example on the market side because the alcohol market is legal and regulated. I mean, you could go into a grocery store right now and buy enough alcohol to kill yourself. Like, alcohol is a drug. It can be extremely detrimental to your health, to your life, to your family, all of those things. And yet we allow adults to make that choice. But what have we done with alcohol on the accountability side? We have said we're not going to use an arrest as accountability unless you're putting other people at danger, unless you're breaking other laws. So you can sell alcohol legally to adults. You can buy alcohol and drink it in the comfort of your own home if you want to. You can go out and use it at a restaurant, drink it at a restaurant. You can't get behind the wheel after you are drunk. That's where that accountability comes in to keep the rest of the community safe. So with alcohol, we've built in both things. We don't say you can do whatever you want, but we also don't say you can't do it at all. We've taken this middle path, which I think is the path of reducing harm rather than trying to go this all or nothing approach in either direction. It can go badly in either direction. Either the arrest side can go really badly, but also the sort of hands off, let's just kind of let people do what they want if they're struggling. I don't think that serves their interest or the community's best interest. And so there is a middle path where you can provide accountability and also just to realize there's other kinds of accountability. An arrest is not the only kind of accountability in the world. You might think about alcohol. You might lose your marriage. You might lose your job. You might lose your house. There are lots of other kinds of accountability that are going to confront you in your life if alcohol begins to consume your life. And those are going to be really painful. There's ways to provide legal accountability to keep communities safe, as well as the kind of community accountability that helps people feel the weight and the hurt of the decisions they're making if they're painful.
Well, and you use alcohol as an example. Prohibition showed us that when we tried to make it illegal, it really just made it worse. And it made it a lot more dangerous. And it created a whole criminal element that wasn't there before and disappeared once they legalized it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So Stanley Gowarick asks, are there countries or other models that we can look at who've done some of this that we can learn from, that you're aware of?
Yeah. So different countries have done different things. Portugal decriminalized possession of all drugs. So they still have illicit markets. They still have contaminated drugs, but they don't arrest consumers now for possession of drugs. And they also built out a huge support system. Treatment is very easy to access there. They gave, tax breaks to businesses that were hiring people, like all kinds of things, try to make housing more affordable and more accessible for people. So they did both sides of that, but they spend the majority of their funding on this prevention and treatment side. And the US does the opposite. We spend the majority of our funding on the enforcement side. And Portugal's injection drug use rate dropped in half. Their addiction rates dropped by a third. Drug-related crime dropped. Most property crimes and prostitution are engaged in because people are trying to get enough money to feed an addiction, to fund an addiction. And so when you see those addiction rates drop, those collateral damage harms are also dropping along with that, including property crimes, things like that. So Portugal did that. Canada has done some really interesting things on opening the door to heroin assisted treatment. That's not legal in the US, but it is, statistically speaking, the most effective form of treatment for heroin addiction is to actually allow people to access medical grade heroin under the care of a medical provider. And I think it speaks to so much of what we've misunderstood culturally about addiction, because really what it does is allows people to have health care, to have connection point to someone who can help them address the root causes of that drug use. And it removes them from that rat race of spending all day long, just trying to get enough money to get heroin, to keep using. It lets them move that, all of that mental space and time into how can we rebuild your life? We're not going to take away your drug yet. There is no taking away of the drug. It's not like you get 6 months and then you get cut off. How are we going to actually just help you build a life you want to be fully present for? And what they find is that when they approach it that way, people on their own decrease their heroin use over time. That's really powerful. It's not the story that we're told culturally. We're told people, if they have access to this, they're just going to use and use and use, and they'll never get better. That is not what the research says. Switzerland has done the same thing. And what they find is that people can stabilize. They can begin to dream again about their life and fill it up with positive things. And they decrease their own use over time. And many of them end up stopping their use after a couple of years.
Amazing. Gosh, we're almost out of time. George, do you have any last questions for Christina before I know you had.
Yeah. I definitely want to, how can people get connected to End It for Good? How can they get connected to the work you're doing and get a hold of the book?
Yep. You can find the book on Amazon. We tried to make it very affordable for everyone, and 75% of proceeds from the book go right back to End It for Good. So if you buy the book, you're supporting the mission, helping us go out there and educate more people. You can do that at Amazon. I also posted the link to our website. You can come sign up for our newsletter, which I write, sending out thoughts, sending out resources, sending out anything that we think could be helpful. Would love to connect with you that way. And there's also, I put a link in there. It's at enditforgood.com/freebies. We have a couple of resources there, ways to help people struggling with addiction, ways to have productive conversations on polarizing topics. So maybe you have some other passion in your life that's not drugs or addiction or how we approach those, and you just want to understand how to communicate what you're passionate about in a way that's winsome and that people will listen to. We've done 37 events as an organization. We've learned a lot about how to talk about a really difficult issue in a way that draws people in and really has great dialogue. We'd love to share that with you. So come join us, enditforgood.com. You can connect with us on social media at enditforgoodms. We'd love to connect with you, and I put my email address also in the chat. Feel free to shoot me an email. Love to talk more.
Thank you, Christina. I just have to say I'm a big fan. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank
and really loved your talk today. And there's so many more things I'd like to hear from you. But thank you to you, Christina, for being here today. Thanks for the work you're doing. This webinar is recorded. It will be available on our free smartphone app. If you go to your app store and look for Center of Addiction and Faith, it's just chock full of resources. You won't believe everything that's on there, but all of our webinars, all of our podcasts, sermon material, there's news stories, there's a help finder. It's a great tool to have in your hands. So go and get this app at the Center of Addiction and Faith. Our annual conference is coming up in October 2024. We're toying with the idea of doing it virtually. And so be watching for information on that. Next month, we'll feature Pastor Barry Lehman, who's the Executive Director of Mastering Recovery. Pastor Barry has published several books and teaches on how to build long-lasting recovery. I hope you'll tune in for that. Some nice comments in the chat page and in the Q&A about how much you were appreciated today, Christina. So again, my thanks to you. And George, thank you for your friendship, your collaboration, and for the amazing work you're doing to help those who still suffer.
Wow. Thank you,
finally,
Christina. I love this.
Thank you guys so much for having me. This is wonderful.
Yes, it is. Thank you all for being here today and for caring about this vitally important topic. And I invite you now to go in peace and serve the Lord.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.